Being able to build and deploy full-stack applications is a crucial developer skill nowadays, and today we're going to learn how to do so using modern web technologies like Vue.js, which is a popular JavaScript frontend framework, Node.js along with Express for creating the REST API, and MongoDB, which is the most popular NoSQL database out there. What is usually known by the name of the MEVN stack. By the end of this video, we will deploy the app to the internet, so you can share this project with your friends. If you are new to the channel, please like and subscribe, and now let's take a look at what we are going to be building today. The app consists in an interface to create bucket list items, so you can keep track of everything that you want to do before dying. We can remove the items that we no longer want, and we can edit current values. As you can see, we are live in the internet, and every request is being sent to our backend node server. We will start from scratch, and I will explain every step involved in this process. Let's start by setting up MongoDB. We're going to be using Mongo Atlas, which is a service to store Mongo in the cloud. You could also set up Mongo locally for the purpose of this video. First, sign up for an account. Once you're done, select the free plan that gives you a sandbox that you can play around with a Mongo cluster. We're going to select the default settings here for the region and the type of cluster. You could change the name of the cluster if you want to, but for the video, we will keep it to the default. Once you save the settings, let's wait for a few minutes since it can take a little bit of time to create a cluster. When the process is complete, let's click on the Connect button, which will give us a quick way to add user and whitelist IP addresses for connecting. Let's start with the user. You want to make sure that you use a strong password and save this for later since we will use this in our application. The IP address that we are going to set up for this tutorial will give access to anyone that has your user and password. Ideally, this IP address should be the one that you have your server in production, but let's keep it open for the tutorial. When you have added that, in the next step, select this option that will give you the URI that we will be using to connect to the cluster. Replace the password and save this configuration for later when we set up our backend. Now, moving on with the project, let's create a folder that we will be working on. Let's give it a name and then cd into the project. We will initialize our package.json with npm. At this point, make sure that you have installed Node.js in your computer. You can download Node.js from the official website to Mac, Linux, or Windows. Now let's open the project with VS Code. We're going to install some of the dependencies needed for this project. We will start with the backend. Express will be our backend framework. As we mentioned before, Mongoose will give us tools to connect and interact with MongoDB. Body parser will transform the body of the request to JSON, and Course will allow our front-end dev server to make AJAX calls to the backend. And finally, Morgan will log all the incoming requests to the server. For the dev dependencies, we are going to be using NodeMon, which is a tool to keep our application running and refreshing every time we made a change, and concurrently, which allow us to run two commands at the same time. We will be using this to run our backend server and our frontend dev server at the same time. For the next part, let's create a new file called server.js, which will be our entry point for the application. Let's quickly make a Hello World app to see if everything is working as expected. Let's require Express and declare our app at the port that we want to listen. Now let's declare this get method from the app that will return a hello world message to anyone requesting access to the root of our server. Finally, let's listen to that port and log to the console if the operation was successful. Let's open the terminal and execute our program. We can see that the server is running correctly. For the next part, we are going to be adding some scripts to run our server and change the main property to the server.js. We will refresh our application every time we make a change, and we are passing the ignore flag to ignore our client Vue app that we are going to set up now. Let's create a new app with the Vue CLI. First, make sure that you have installed that in your system. And now let's create our app with this command. The name of the app will be client. Because I have Yarn installed in my computer, I'm going to be using the M flag, which will tell the CLI to use npm to install the packages. Here, let's select the manually option. It should take a minute to install everything. Now let's take a look at what we have in our package.json of the client. We can see that we have a serve script that we can use to run the frontend app with hot reload. What we want to do now is being able to run the dev script from the server and the one from the client at the same time. Of course, you can run one at a time, but it would be more convenient to have both running with one command. Let's go to the package.json of the server, and there we will have the following script. What this command will do is run our dev server from the root of the folder. We are going to use the prefix flag so we can run this in the client folder. And now let's add a dev script. What this will be doing is run our server and our client at the same time, as I mentioned before. We can test the script and we can see that we have both outputs. And the last thing that I want for this initial configuration is that I want to be able to make API calls from the client with the root path of our server. I mean, without the need to add localhost to every request. In order to do that, I'm going to add a new vue.config.js file, and we will have the following configuration. We only need this for development, so we don't want to add the URL in our AJAX request from the frontend. And every time we try to access the API path, we will proxy the request to localhost 3000. In this case, is the place where our backend is running. Now that we have our starter project, let's begin with our backend API. We will start by adding a config file. We can use this file to connect to the correct port and to MongoDB. In the root of the project, create a file called config.js and add the following. We are exporting a config object that has the Mongo URI that we will be using to connect to our Mongo cluster. This will be the one that we configured before in Mongo Atlas. I'm going to store this as an environment variable because I don't want to check this sensitive information to GitHub. I advise you to do the same, but you could also have the URI in plain text here if you don't plan to publish this repository. This will store the Mongo URI as an environment variable that we can read in our code with process.env. Be aware that this variable will only be available as long as we keep this terminal session open. So for future use, you can add this to your bash profile where you have other env variables. For Windows, you can run the same command, but make sure that you are using the git bash terminal. For the port, we'll also be using an environment variable that usually is set in our production servers. If we don't have that variable, it will fall back to the port 3000. Now that we have our config, let's open the server.js file and let's connect to MongoDB with Mongoose. First, let's require Mongoose and our config file that we just created. And then let's try to connect. Because the connection is an asynchronous operation, we're going to be using promises, and once the DB is connected, we're going to console log a message. If the operation fails, we're going to log the error. We are passing some configuration here, so make sure to pause the video and copy this configuration. Let's run our server to see if this works. As you can see, we are logging the success message, which means that we connected successfully to MongoDB. Finally, we are going to make use of the other libraries that we installed. Course will allow us to make AJAX requests from our frontend dev server to the backend. Morgan will log every request to the server in the console, and we are using the tiny configuration that gives us small messages. And body parser will transform the body of every request to JSON. Once we have this setup, let's create a schema and Mongo module with the Mongoose. I'm going to create a new folder called modules, and here we will create a file called bucketlistitem.js. So this will be the name of our module. Let's import a schema and model from Mongoose. And now let's declare our schema. It will be an object that has a description property, which is a required string. And it will also have a date that is the type of JavaScript date object. And the default value will be the current time of the server. Now we're going to declare our module with the schema and export it so it can be used from other files. Now that we have declared our modules, let's create the routes for the REST API. I'm going to create a new folder called routes, and in here let's create a file called bucketlisteitems in a folder called API. Here first require the modules that we need. We're going to be using router from Express and our module that we declared before. Now let's declare an instance of the router. The first route that we are going to declare is the root of this endpoint. We're going to use our router get method that can handle get requests, and for the second argument we can pass an async callback function to handle our logic. Because this is the root of our endpoint, we're going to await for all the items in the collection with the find method that we have in our module. If there is no results, we're going to throw an error. Otherwise, we're going to first sort the response by date using the rateSort method, and then transform our data object to milliseconds so we can subtract it and compare it. Finally, we're going to send back our sorted items response with a status of 200. Because this promise could fail, let's handle a possible error with a try-catch block. If the request fails, we're going to send back a 500 error with the message of the error. Now let's handle a post request to create new items. We're going to use the post method of our router, and we're going to listen again to the root of this endpoint. The callback will be an async function that takes the request and the response as parameters. Now let's declare a variable with our bucketlistitem constructor. We will pass our rect.body that has all the properties that we need to store to the constructor. Let's add another try-catch block that will handle our async code. We're going to declare a bucketlistitem const that will be the result of our module save operation. Don't forget to await the result. If we don't have a result, we're going to throw an error, and then we are going to send the object saved with a 200 status. The catch block again will send back a 500 error with the error message. For updating existing items, we are going to use the put method of our router, and we are going to declare the ID of the item as a param with this colon syntax. For our async callback function, we're going to use our try-catch block, and first let's deconstruct our ID from the request.params object. With that, let's await for the find by ID and update method from our model. The first param will be our ID, and our second is going to be our updated item that comes from the request.body. This method will make sure that this item exists, and then it will update it. I want to return the updated object to the client. For doing that, I will spread the response that underscore doc, which is the doc that was found with the method, and then I will merge it with the updated properties that come from the request.body of the request. As before, we check that we have a response, and then we send it back with a status of 200. Otherwise, we throw an error and send back a status of 500 with the message of the error. Finally, we need a way to delete our items. For doing that, we are going to use our delete method from our router. And like our put method, we're going to declare the ID of the item as a param with this colon syntax. The async callback function in here will also have a try-catch block. We first use the ID from the rect.params object and then let's await for find by ID and delete from our module. This method will take the ID as a param and it will return the removed item. If we have the item, we send a 200 response, otherwise we throw an error and then send a 500 response with the message. Now let's export our router so it can be used from other files. At this point we have declared all of our routes and modules. Now we only need to use them in our entry point file. Let's open server.js and require our routes. Then we're going to use the rows from the ap/bucket-list items endpoint. It's time to do some testing. I'm going to be using Insomnia, which is an amazing tool for debugging APIs, but feel free to use Postman or other tool if you prefer. Let's create a new request that in this case will be a GET request that points to API/bucket-list items. Let's make the request and we can see that we get an empty array as expected because we don't have any item yet. We can now add a new item to our collection using the post method. The endpoint will be the same and let's pass some JSON body to the request. Cool, we have a 200 response with the object that was created. Now let's update the value of the description with an emoji and we will use a put method with the ID of the object as a param. And you can see that we just updated the object. I will add another item with our post method and let's remove this item as previous with the ID param. And finally let's remove it with our delete endpoint. We will need to pass the ID of the item to the URL and let's use the delete option here in Insomnia. Now that we have our server ready, let's move on to the Vue frontend. First, let's open the terminal and cd to the client folder. There we will install Axios. Axios will help us to make AJAX requests to our server. Feel free to use the native Fetch API if you want or any other tool. Let's cd back to the root of the folder and run the server and the frontend at the same time. Now let's clean up our code. In the app.vue file, I will first remove the initial code and then I will remove the initial component. Now open the index.html file of the public folder and here we are going to add the CDN for Bulma, which is an amazing CSS framework that we are going to be using, and also let's add the CDN for material icons so we can have icons in our application. Now let's move to the app.vue and the first thing that we are going to do is fetch all the items from the server. Let's first declare a new data property that will be an empty array to store all of our items. Now let's use the mount view lifecycle hook to make our API call to get the items. This hook will be called when all of our DOM elements are rendered into the screen. Then we are going to use the async keyword so we can make use of await. For making the AJAX call, we are going to use Axios, so let's import Axios first. Now in the mount function, let's await for the API call with the get method from Axios. We will pass the route of our backend API and then let's store the response in a variable. Now let's assign the data of the response to the items data property of the component. This should take care of fetching our data, but now we need to display this data to the DOM. Let's first add a div with the ID of app and give it some style so it does not expand in all the screen. Now for every item we are going to use a div that has the notification CSS Bulma class. Let's add here the v4 directive in the element and we will read the item and the index from the items array. We will also bind the key prop with the ID of every item. This will help Vue to keep track of which DOM elements are being added or removed from the DOM. The children of this element will be a P node, and inside we are going to bind the item description with the Vue template syntax. We now should be able to see a DOM node for each item. Now we need a way to add new items with the frontend. Let's first add an input element with the help of Bulma CSS classes. This will give us an input and a button to add new items. Now we are going to declare a new data property. The initial value will be an empty string that we will be binding to our input with vmodule. Vmodule will take care of reading and updating the description property every time we interact with the element. Now we need a way to save the value of the input to the backend. Let's add a click event listener to our button and pass the add item function to it. We will also disable the button if there is nothing in the description, so we don't have empty values. The add item method does not exist yet, so let's create in the methods part of our component. This method will use async and await, so let's add the async keyword at the start of the method. Here we will first await to the post request that we are making with Axios. The route will be the same as the one from our get call, and the data will be an object that has our current description value of our company. Once this is completed, we are going to be pushing to the items array the data value of the response, which is our item created. After that, we need to reset our input to the initial state. Let's test this out. We will add a couple of items and we can see that this worked as expected. Now we need a way to remove items from the database. For doing that, let's change our item HTML markup so we can have two columns. We will create a new element with the columns class provided by Bulma and a column class to each child. The second child will have the isNarrow class, so it only uses the space that it needs. The second child will have our material icon element, and we will listen to the click event to call the remove item method with the item and the index as arguments. The remove item method will be also async. We will first await for the Axios.delete method. The route will be our base URL concatenated with the ID of the item so the server knows what we are going to delete. After that, we are going to remove the item from our items array with the splice method. Let's test this out. You can see that this item is removed from the DOM, and if we refresh the screen, we can see that the changes were persisted to the DB. The only thing that our UI is missing now is the ability to edit current items. For doing that, we are going to be adding an edit icon and at the left of the delete icon. To keep track of what we are updating, I'm going to create two new data properties. The edit description will be a string that gets updated when we edit the item, and the selected object will be the item that we click. Now let's add a select method that we will invoke when we click in the edit icon of an item. This method will take the item as parameter, and it will update the selected and edit description state with the item values. Now let's add the event listener to the icon. We now need to display an input box based on the selection. We will use the if directive that it will render the element if the selected .id prop is the same as the one from the item. The value that we are going to bind here to the vmodule is the edit description property that we created before to keep track of what we are editing. Don't forget to add the else directive to the plain read-only p tag, so this will be displayed if the previous condition is false. Let's test if this works. I don't want to write all of this select logic every time I need to check if an item is selected, so let's write a method that can handle this. This method will return a boolean that indicates if an item is selected or not. Now let's use this in our template. So much better, don't you think? Once we are in edit mode, I would like to have a way to go back to read-only mode, and also a way to save the changes. Let's add that. I am using a ternary operator here. If the item is selected, I'm going to show the close icon, otherwise it will show the edit icon. Let's do the same for our click listener. If the item is selected, we can unselect, otherwise we will select. Let's now write our unselect method. This method does not receive any params and will only set or edit data to the default. We are going to do the same for the trash icon. If the item is selected, we will show the save icon, otherwise we will show the delete one. The click event will also have logic. If the item is selected, we will update, otherwise we are going to remove it. The updated item method will look like this. It takes the item and the index as params. We will first await for the put operation with Axios and store the result in a const declaration. The route will be our base URL concatenated with the item.id param. The data to update that Axios takes as a second param will be an object with the edit description that we keep track in our state. Once that is completed, we will update our array with the updated value with the data of the response. After that, we are going to unselect so the user leaves the edit mode. Let's test this out. We can see that we can enter the edit mode and then leave it by clicking in the close icon. If we want to update, we click the save button and the item leaves the edit mode. Let's refresh the page and we can see that our changes are being persisted to the Mongo database. Finally, let's add the CSS so the icon's cursor is a pointer when we hover in. And let's add an h1 tag with the title of the site. Now that we have everything working, let's deploy our application to Heroku. Heroku is a managed infrastructure platform to deploy applications, and this means that we don't have to set up any server manually. It offers a free tier that is the one that we are going to be using. Before deploying, we need to add some scripts to package the JSON of the server. These scripts will be executed when we deploy our application. The first scripts will run our application when deploying. Heroku requires this start script. The next one will build our client from the root of our app. We will first need to install the dependencies of the client and then build the Vue app with a build command prefixed for the client folder. This command will run when we push our code to Heroku. Now the final thing that I want to do is that I want to serve our static files from the Vue client. So I'm going to the server.js file, and here first I'm going to check if we are in production. So make sure you remove this hello world message that we had here, and I'm going to check if we are in production. So we are using the node env variable, and this will only be true if we are in our production server or if you change your environment variable. So what we want to use here is we want to use the static method from Express, and what we want to serve is the dist folder that is going to be created when we build our application with with the build command. And then what I want to do here is for every path that everyone is trying to access, we are going to send the HTML file. So we are using res.send file, and what we are going to send is the client dist index HTML file. So we are making use of path, and we need to import path, required path at the top of our file. So once we have set up everything here, let's move on to Heroku. And if you haven't signed up for an account yet, do sign up. And once you are in the dashboard, we are going to create a new application. So the name of the application for me would be this one, but you feel free to add any name that you want. So I'm going to create the application, and we can see that we need to install the Heroku CLI. So if we go back here, we have a bunch of options to install depending on the system that you are. Because I'm in Mac, I will prefer to use Brew. And we also have some installers for Windows, and in Ubuntu you can use the command line. Once you have that, let's go back to our project and open the terminal. And what we want to check here is if it was installed the Heroku CLI, and we can see that we have this version. The next step will be to log into our account, so we can run Heroku login, and this will open a browser tab that will prompt us to log in. So now we're logged into our account, and because Heroku uses Git to push your code to the server, make sure that you have Git installed in your computer. So what we want to do here before initializing our Git is that the Vue CLI by default initialize a Git repository in the client. So if we go to the client, we can see that we have Git there, but we don't want to have a repository in the client. We want to have a repository in the root of our project. So I will make sure to remove Git. I'm going to remove Git by removing the Git folder. So this folder was created with the CLI, and this will remove Git from this folder. So we no longer have Git in the client. So let's go back to the root. And now that we clean that up, we also will need to add a git ignore file. So make sure to create this file, and what we want to add in this file is the .NOT modules folder, because we don't want to check all of this huge folder to Git. So once you have your git ignore file, let's initialize Git in the root of the folder. So we initialized Git here, and what I want to do now is I'm going to stage all of our changes. So we stage all of the changes, and now I'm going to commit this. So we have a clean tree now, and I'm going now to add the Heroku remote with this command. So this we will use the Heroku CLI, and we can say git remote add, and what we are going to add is the name of our project. So this is the name that we created in Heroku. So this is the name. It will be different for yours, and this is the remote that we are going to add. Once that is added, as you remember, we had our Mongo URI as an environment variable. So we need to have this environment variable also in Heroku. For doing that, I'm going to use the Heroku CLI, and we can say that the Heroku config set Mongo URI is the name of the variable, is going to equals all of this string. So make sure that you have quotes here, and let's hit enter. This will add the variable to the server. Now I want to add one more thing, is because we need, as you remember, we are building our application from the root. We need to install all the dependencies of the client, and all of the dependencies of the client to build our application are dev dependencies. So that's why we need to set this npm config production to false, so it can install those dependencies. So I'm going to set that config variables, and now we are good to go. So for pushing our code, we are going to use git, and we are going to push to the Heroku origin the master branch. So this will trigger the build, and now it's installing all of our dependencies. It should take a while, so I will pause the video and I will go back. Okay, the build was completed, and now we can open this URL. That is our public URL to our application. If we open this URL, we can see that the app was loaded successful. So we have our items, and we can edit, and we can see that this was updated. If you have reached to this part of the tutorial, congratulations. Thanks for sticking to the end, and if you enjoyed this content, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. This really helps to keep the content, and it can also reach to more people.